Well, good morning, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here, and I thank my friend Dominic very much for putting together this meeting, and I'm just delighted to see the attendance that we have. So my task is to give some background on the history of electrohypersensitivity, and I think let me echo some of the comments that Lennart just made, that EHS is something that's very closely related to a variety of other syndromes. Other syndromes that may have had a different etiology in beginning, but have many common symptoms. Symptoms of headaches, of fatigue, of mental dullness, and these include some that you've already heard of. Certainly multiple chemical sensitivity, which is a part of this meeting. Chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, Gulf War illness. I have a research project on Gulf War illness, and if you didn't know the history of exposure, you would think that the disease is exactly the same as electrohypersensitivity. So not to say these are all identical, but to say that they're a complex series of diseases that we have little understanding of the mechanisms of any of them, but they must have some commonalities. So I think that's something worth further describing and talking about. Leonard also gave some sense of the fact that Western countries have had forever the concept that the only possible adverse effect of electromagnetic fields is tissue heating. If you can bake your potato in a microwave oven, you don't want to have people using microwave sources such that they would heat their body. And if you have safety standards at levels that prevent tissue heating, then there cannot possibly be any adverse health effect. And this concept is such a matter of faith among the engineering and the physics community that they offhand reject and discard any evidence to the contrary, no matter how strong that evidence is. I think this is really one of the fundamental problems that we have. Leonard also mentioned that the Soviets, for many, many years, have had the sense that there are effects on the nervous system at very much lower levels, and that those effects included headache, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and that they were disabling. Well, there's been this back and forth failure to come to any agreement. But there is this enormous body of evidence, and it's not just in the former Soviet literature, that electromagnetic fields do have activities. This is a statement quoted from, it's a summary of Soviet literature that says that all organisms are sensitive to electromagnetic fields. And I didn't know this term, procrustean, which dates from the stories of the man that wanted everybody to be the same size. And so he'd put you on a bed. If your legs hung over the edge, he'd cut them off. If your legs didn't eat the edge of the bed, he would stretch you till they did. The idea that everybody reacts exactly the same. The concept here is that some people are more sensitive than others. And I think that is absolutely what we see with electrohypersensitivity. Well, starting in 1953, the Soviets irradiated the US Embassy in Moscow with microwaves. This created enormous anxiety among the Americans. First of all, concern that the Soviets knew something that we didn't know, and secondly, that they must be trying to kill us. Well, it's actually very interesting to try to ferret out what actually happened. There were studies that resulted in big reports to the U.S. government that were classified, and they were whatever was released was specifically changed by our Department of Defense. So who knows what really came out. The story as we know it today is that there were no elevations in cancer, at least over the short term, but that many people that worked in the embassy developed headaches, mental fatigue, difficulty concentrating, they were irritable, and this was all passed off as being anxiety. And what we find today is that people that experience the symptoms of electrohypersensitivity, when they see their physician, are usually referred to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. They're anxious, it's not a real disease. But microwave illness is electrohypersensitivity. Now, while the mainstream literature in the West, and I certainly include not just Europe and North America, but Australia and to some extent Japan, while the main focus there was entirely on preventing tissue heating, Fry in the early 60s had a series of reports from animal studies, some from human studies, that concluded that there are major effects at non-thermal levels. And he has this interesting quote: peak rather than average power density was determined to be the more important variable in the study of the effect of modulated low power density RF energy on biological functions. I think one issue that is still very much unsettled is what is the function of frequency? From extra low frequencies, the electricity frequencies, up through the AM, FM radio, the microwave frequencies, the higher level of frequencies, and there isn't really a very clear pattern there. But what we are now seeing, and I've been particularly impressed around smart meters that use very high intensity but very brief pulses, appear to make people very ill. And the whole concept that Millam has developed of dirty electricity, you know, we've been focused on the sine wave, and the sine wave may not be what's really important. It may be sudden peaks, transients, harmonics, things like that, that we need to pay much more attention to. Next slide here. All right, Leonard mentioned that there were some older studies on exposure to radar. The high-intensity microwaves really came in with the, after World War II with the development of radar. And you can find these reports in the 80s and up into the 90s of individuals, perfectly healthy, normal individuals that had a sudden exposure to higher intensity radar. And in this case by Foreman, 2 men accidentally exposed to microwaves at levels that didn't cause obvious burns, but both exhibited headaches, insomnia, irritability, and emotional lability, which lasted for 2 years. Later studies by Schilling showed of a variety of men showed basically the same thing, that a sudden exposure to high intensity resulted in a permanent change in sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. And Dr. Ray, who's here, published this study in 1991, a long time ago, showing that when he took 100 people that reported they were electrosensitive into a laboratory and then applied or did not apply radiofrequency exposure, he found that some of them could not distinguish whether the fields were on or not, but some could. So I think one would draw from this that not everybody that says they're electrosensitive probably is, but on the other hand, since the public frequently suffers from insomnia, from headaches, from multiple pains and mental fog, many people that have the syndrome probably are totally unaware of what's causing their symptoms. So the few studies that have been done, Dr. Ray's study is one, the study of McCarthy et al. Of a single individual, but done in a very controlled environment, show that the syndrome is real, that in sensitive people, exposure will induce the profile that that individual receives characteristically. Not every individual is the same. Everybody's legs are not equally long. So some people get headaches, some people get cardiac issues, but in controlled setups, if done properly, one can demonstrate that EHS is real. Now, I've had occasion to either meet or talk extensively with a number of people that have impressed upon me how acute exposures to high intensities can trigger the syndrome. This man who came to my office about a year ago was a contract technician working for Verizon in California. He was to go into a generator facility that had some large number of RF generators to do some repair work. They were all supposed to be turned off. 3 of them were not turned off. He worked there about an hour, began to feel hot and nauseous and with a headache, came out, and when I saw him years later, this man had full-blown electrohypersensitivity syndrome. Constant headaches, photophobia, tinnitus, mentally not sharp any longer. Very clear example of someone that would have been previously healthy, and you cannot tell me that being an hour in some exposure is going to change psychologically a person to that degree that he showed. This is a different circumstance, and this person I've only been in touch with by email and multiple emails. This was not a case of being exposed to microwaves, but this was a case of moderate electrocution. He lost consciousness, he didn't go into cardiac arrest, but as with the other person, he suffered electrohypersensitivity, and it did not go away over a period of many years. Another person, this time a man and his wife, again, they lived in California. They were totally healthy. He was an engineer, his wife was a physician. They went on vacation. Unbeknownst to them, the utility replaced their analog meter with a smart meter while they were away. They came back, they both developed this syndrome of hypersensitivity. And they both had symptoms of headaches, tinnitus, heart palpitations, and insomnia. Once they found out that the smart meter had been put on the house, the symptoms would go away if they didn't go into the house. They would recur if they did go into the house. So one question is, does electrohypersensitivity always develop after acute events? I think certainly many people, perhaps most people that suffer from the syndrome don't recognize any particular time when they were excessively exposed. So I don't mean to imply that everybody has to have had that one excessive exposure. But I think when so much of the medical and regulatory community denies the existence of this syndrome, the evidence that when perfectly healthy people have an exposure event that triggers the syndrome that then lasts at least for up to 4 years and probably for life, this is pretty strong evidence that this syndrome is real. Now, Leonard mentioned the issue of children in schools, and I think this is a particularly important thing. when you have Wi-Fi computer classrooms. Every kid obviously needs to be able to get on the internet. When you have a Wi-Fi computer classroom with a router that generates enormous amounts of radio frequency, we already are hearing of children becoming electrosensitive and developing headaches when they're in that environment. And children have many years of life to live, we hope. And so this is really something that requires urgent attention. It's important that we find better ways of identifying people that really have the syndrome. There needs to be care given to people that suffer symptoms independent of what causes them. But I think there is part of the feeling from the medical community that these people are just in need of a psychologist is because we haven't defined it better. We haven't developed objective ways of determining electrohypersensitivity. That is certainly something that's needed, and I think we'll hear more about that in this talk. So my conclusion is that electrohypersensitivity is real. It's been known for many, many years. The Soviets had it right when they talked about neurasthenia as a result of exposure to radio frequency fields. I think that we in the medical community need to pay more attention to the variety of other symptoms. And I'm so pleased that we're talking about multiple chemical sensitivity at this meeting as something similar to, but perhaps a little bit different from electrohypersensitivity. But this is these are complex profiles of diseases that share many things in common. In my judgment, maybe because I'm really trained as a neurobiologist, these are primarily diseases of the central nervous system. Headaches, fatigue, mental dullness, all of these things are, the brain is the key to understanding this. But we need to have much greater research on mechanisms and try to understand how the nervous system is altered by all of these different processes to cause this disease. Thank you very much for your attention.